So how did dystopian fiction develop following the publication or the translation of the book, Martin?
Well, I have to say, Marko's knowledge of Russia, you can see why he's here. It's incredible, isn't it, to see? Were you seeing, look, I was just listening to that, seeing, they say history repeats itself as tragedy and then as farce. I think we're at the farce level at the moment because you can see what's happening. If you see about everyone from these external allies trying to influence what's going on, you don't, in the revolution, you just make a little bit of a leap there to see what's going on in the world a little bit later on, should we say. I won't put any specific number on it. But in terms of the rulers, in terms of the people who were running these ideal worlds that weren't, they changed, because in that H.G. Wells book, When the Sleeper Wakes, we've got these rulers who are kind of, you might say, well, the idea of just a bit shallow and a bit hedonistic, not unlike certain politicians these days, we might say. But then once English readers and writers and people interested in literature are reading translations of because it struggled with getting translated and coming across. Only got translated into Russian, which it was originally written in was it the 80s? Was it?
You mean published in Russia in 1988? Yeah.
So 1988, ironically, the year before the fall of communism. So the book in translation has lived the whole life of the communist revolution, and in fact puts its head round the door when it's all gone. I don't know what Zamyatin would have thought about that if he'd been alive to see that. Would have probably thought that was quite ironic. So what happens in the meantime? Well, Western writers and idealists and authors and thinkers are hearing what's going on, and they're seeing all this change. You've got the First and Second World War, and journalists, stroke writers, we get this sort of crossover with people like Huxley and people like Orwell. Orwell he was striving for some kind of better world because all he could see around him, everything he went to, whether he's fighting the Spanish Revolution or whether he's out on the streets trying to see what it's like to be down and out, all he can see is misery. But you can see in a different way why he's looking in the same way as Zamyatin is for some kind of better world or more interesting world. You can see his experiences are making him feel that it's less and less going to find it. But the people who are in charge in the book, certainly the people who are in charge in 1984, are not hedonistic and shallow anymore. They are nasty, horrific, violent, cruel, brutal fanatics is the phrase that we get. Terror is now the picture of the totalitarian ruler. Don't forget, he's hearing about the purges, the show trials, what's going on in Russia, Stalin and all that. So his fear is absolute, and the fact that he does come up with this whole idea of CCTV, which we see all around us now. If he was alive and living in his flat in Canonbury, there was an article in the Evening Standard a few years ago that identified the fact that there are actually 5 CCTV cameras, just by chance, not deliberately, catching the actual entry and exit to his very flat that he lived in. So the irony of that, I'm sure, is not lost on you. So he's writing about CCTV, about our attitude to security, about knowledge, about individuality. There's that one little place in his room where he can write his diary. The camera doesn't quite catch him. So still he preserves this little moment of secrecy, but being on your own, which is something that people would look down on there, but it's something that Orwell realises sacrosanct, something that's important. So I have this sort of little 30-year thing. He's writing this at the end of the 40s, 50s, let's say. Run forward 30 years, we get to the 80s, CCTV everywhere. Now we have Huxley writing Brave New World in the early 30s. He claims he never read Zamyatin, he didn't know about Zamyatin, but I challenge you to read those 2 books and tell me honestly if you think Huxley did not read We. I cannot believe that, although he protested loud and long. Well, let's do the 30 years rule on that as well. He's writing that in the 30s, mid-30s, 30 years later. His book is about how we use drugs to pacify and control people. So let's go forward 30 years, mid-30s, and it's flower power in the 60s, and what's happening there? So that's just my little idea. That's kind of what we call the 30-year rule as such. I'm going to, just before I return you to Marko, just going to show you that because obviously this is purely, don't have to go away and discuss this as any kind of logical, structured, thoughtful view. It's just what we think. This is the translation of Zamyatin from the late 70s. Marko's one is a more recent one. Is it 90s? Right?
Yeah, it's. Yeah.
This is the latest Penguin version of 1984, of course, which has got the title very clever. You can imagine being the person who thought that. Oh, and you can see it. You can see the title. We've got Huxley's Brave New World, and of course he lived long enough to be able to write Brave New World Revisited, which for me kind of spoils it slightly. Shut up, we'll read the book, we'll make our own minds up. Don't tell us what it's about. It's a bit like trying to own everything. But as we know, writers are like that. Here's another, this is the same Penguin guy, isn't it, working at publishing. Obviously, this was another one of his efforts. This is, I should make you guess, what is it? No, it's not Jane, it's some proper Dorothy. Okay. Then a little bit later on, we're going to talk about her a bit later on, Margaret Atwood, Handmaid's Tale. A friend of mine was chief examiner for AQA and put that on the syllabus, Stella Camwell, MBE, but she put that on the syllabus, and you might think, books on a syllabus, what does that mean? That's incredibly important. That in the UK, we had something like, 25,000 young minds reading that book every year, and that's since it went on at the end of the 90s. So how many young minds have read that? And that they, of course, then say to mum and dad, that book you read called 1984, you've got to read this. So we hope that's how it works. This is Hal Jacobson. This is from last year, actually, as you can see. A mighty novel, shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Man Booker Prize, he didn't win it, unfortunately. I would imagine if there's anyone here, this is the most modern one, I think, probably, that has achieved that kind of status. Suzanne Connin's Hunger Games, which is a quotation from Stephen King. And of course, the newest dystopia of all, this is Ed, the Miliband. So Marko is now going to look a little bit wider about where we go from there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Martin. As Tolstoy put it, there's a million tragedies and only one happy story, which is why we probably hear so much about dystopias and so little about utopias. As Martin said, utopia has got two spellings and two meanings in the original Greek. E-utopia, symbolic, means pleasant place, and o-utopia means no place, while dystopia itself means unpleasant place. So the kind of like contradiction between those two states of being, as it were, can be used by governments in power and oppositions as well. I'm sure it'll be used against them for Jeremy Corbyn, depending on what side of the debate one sits. But essentially, it may be that the whole effects of these dystopian visions may be to make us more happy with the status quo where we are, so that we don't want to change the present too much, because we don't know if the glass going half full might go even further empty, and maybe that we want the level of freedom we have right now to do the rest ourselves. But there's another view. I mean, we wouldn't be human if we didn't have other views of everything, including on dystopian fiction and its place in the modern world. And this one's very different. In a nutshell, it's a bit of a conspiracy, but let's give it an airing. This one argues that the purpose of all dystopian fiction in our modern world is predictive programming. In other words, to overwhelm people with the inevitability of the future, acquaint them with the planned changes to society, so that when these are put into practice, people will already be used to the idea and accepting these changes as a natural progression rather than resisting. Or as Huxley put it in Brave New World, the masses would be falling in love with their servitude. In this interpretation, dystopian fiction like Orwell's is a recommendation masquerading as a warning. And proponents of this idea point out that the leading UK dystopian writers, Wells, Orwell, Huxley, were all members of the Fabians, the Fabian Society, which itself was named after the Roman general Fabius, who used carefully planned strategies to slowly wear down and demoralize his enemies over a long period of time.
Weren't the Miliband's members?
They were actually.
Sorry.
So dystopian fiction is accused by some of employing an identical strategy. It's certainly one of the first literary genres to subvert the convention that's lasted since Aristotle, that the hero should ultimately prevail, he should win. It's a genre where the hero doesn't just lose, he loses big time, or she loses big time, and that's in most dystopian fiction. Having said that, that's not confined just to members of the Fabian Society, because that's what happens in We as well, if I may reveal the ending there. and in obviously 1984, and in, for example, Kafka's Trial, which we haven't mentioned yet, there's a loss without any redemption. So is the aim of dystopian fiction to warn us against such societies or to persuade us we have to accept them? And those who suggest the latter will point to the fact that 1984 was the centenary of the Fabian Society's formation. So there you are. And are we in the dystopic world already? But that's enough political speculation. Over to you, Martin.
Well, I've read again recently this Margaret Atwood's book, Handmaid's Tale, and I find it doesn't fit comfortably with the evolving idea of dystopia. But then it's written by a woman, and I think it's actually making a lot of points that have been we've been waiting for with a kind of void. Not because they haven't been written, but because, as we know, publishing has been held by, organised by men, as indeed language has been for so many hundreds of years. But Atwood's book is in a way kind of going back to the looking at patriarchy and looking at issues that the suffragettes raised, and actually saying that looking at a very, very bleak world. If you have read it, you'll know what I mean. Looking at the role women played simply to have children, and I looked at that and I thought, when I first had the idea for 1999, I thought that's a bleak picture. But you start to think about things that happened in the 1980s that really influenced change, influenced the way dystopia changed from about politics to being more about gender. It's quite interesting that those early dystopian works don't seem to pick up gender nearly as strongly as you might imagine they would. But then again, you might know, well, of course, they were written by men. And if you look at, particularly, if I give you this brilliant game show thing called The Hunger Games, that's also a fantastic work. That's far more where we are now.